Morning, everybody. I also hope you had a nice rest last night and a good dinner. Before I get started, I want to make a special thanks to Christian and the Volkswagen Stiftung for inviting me to come out of my retirement to have a chat with you. And my greetings to all of you. Friends, I see some friendly faces that I've known in the past. Hi, Miho. Your keynote speaker tomorrow morning. And to meet new friends and to talk to you a little bit about some of my experience and some of the observations that I've made over the years. I'm not an academic. I'm an engineer by profession, civil engineer. But as Christian said, I've been around the block. And one of the things that I've done in the last 20, 25 years is observe the way that, or I've been able to observe the way that cities and other human settlements succeed and the way that they fail. And it's very interesting to see that there are some common attributes, irrespective of how unique each settlement is that you work in and you participate in over the years. There are some similarities, and I'll get to those in a moment. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that my reflections on the concept of dangerous landscapes, and ask some questions. And at the end, I'll ask a few more questions as well. So dangerous landscapes. I think Christian mentioned yesterday that a colleague, I don't remember the name, but reminded him that there's no such thing as dangerous landscapes. Landscapes are benign. It's the relationship between people and landscape that creates danger. And for the purpose of today, when we start talking about dangerous landscapes, are we talking about those where the bullets are flying, the bombs are going off? We could, but I think we need to talk about other things. Do we talk about earthquakes and the damage that's caused by earthquakes as a result of the proximity of people? Sorry, I'm trying to get this thing working right. Here's a picture of what once was the largest body of water west of the Missouri in the United States and California. Are we talking about this? Perhaps. And perhaps this is a very important thing to talk about. Or this. You'll all have seen the news about what's happening in Bali right now and the displacement of some 47,000 people as a result of the rumblings in Mount Agung and on Bali. Is it this one that we're talking about? Is this the dangerous landscape? Arguably, sure it is, but I want to talk about something a little bit more inexorable and inevitable in my view, and try to concentrate a little bit on issues related to oceanic conditions as a result of our changing climate. It's this. It's sea level rise. It's coastal erosion. This is a picture from the northwest coast of Alaska, where the rates of coastal erosion last year and this year are between 9 and 33 meters per year. Okay. This is significant. There are dozens of settlements along the northwest coast of Alaska right now that are in the same situation as this place here, Shishmaref. It's a small village, but nonetheless, its inhabitants, the livelihoods, the culture, the cultural connections are lost. And increasingly this is happening throughout the Arctic region and in other parts of the world. Or is it this? This happens to be a picture of a storm surge, but yesterday we heard some very interesting modeling and early warning around early warning systems related to the inundation of water, whether it was from tsunamis or storm surges or flooding from other purposes, but in coastal cities particularly. And it's my view that these last three things, these last three landscapes, are the most dangerous of all. Not necessarily because of the immediate threat to humanity, but to the inexorable and inevitable threat to the land, to the assets, to the social, cultural, environmental assets, are the people who live in these settlements around the world. Okay, so just a few numbers related to this process of sea level rise, from melting glaciers and thermal expansion, these types of things. The higher the sea, the greater the proximity of threat from a range of climatic or meteorological hazards. Okay, you know, it's a bit of crystal ball gazing, but you can see that nobody is 100% sure about the actual scale of sea level rise. But some of science's best minds are able to give us some sense of what it is that we're facing. If we talk about a 1 meter sea level rise over the course of the next 50 to 70 years, then perhaps that's something we can deal with. Perhaps it's something that we can protect cities from. But if we start getting beyond a meter, the cost of protection will vastly outweigh the capacity of cities or states to actually invest in protective types of infrastructure against these kinds of things, against the sea level rise, against the increasing intensity of meteorological events, and including coastal erosion. These are not small numbers either. With a 6.6 or a 2 meter sea level rise, you're talking about exposure of 1 billion people around the planet. Okay? And huge potential losses. Where's the most expensive real estate on the planet generally? It's the beachfront property, isn't it? It's the hotels, it's the other infrastructure. It's private, it's public. These are the kinds of assets that are at risk. And my view is that inevitably, they are at risk. There's a few more numbers just to throw into the mix here. Again, these are estimates, best estimates from different sources, but we look at, from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, their estimates, on average, 21.5 million people per year are displaced as a result of climate-related events. Not all of them are flooding or coastal, but still, it's a big number. An even bigger number is the number of people who've been permanently displaced over the course of the last 7, 8 years. 8 or 9 years, pardon me. 172 million people permanently displaced. These numbers are also estimates, but 8 of the 10 largest world cities are trade hubs on the coast, and they represent potential vulnerability up to 200 million people. The exposure of economic assets, I only have 3 examples here, but if you see the numbers, I'm sure you'll agree with me, when we're talking about financial exposure over the course of the next 60 years, 65 years, these are not small numbers. These are incredibly huge numbers. And this is as a direct result of the exposure of coastal cities that are high-end trading hubs around the world, and the potential impact if nothing is done. Okay. Average annual losses. These are numbers that come from the World Bank and from the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. But again, these are not small numbers. Investment of the loss database for disasters can increase $100 billion over the course of the next 13 years. Again, big numbers, okay? And do we have the capacity, do the cities have the capacity, do even the states have the capacity to make this scale of investment to protect or to adapt to this inevitable consequence of a changing climate? Okay, so the most conservative estimates of sea level rise are about 1 meter over the course of the next 30 to 50 years. Let's keep that timeline in mind here, because I want to talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. However, I don't know if any of you are following what's happening in Antarctica right now with the Pine Island and Thwaites glaciers that are essentially caps that are holding back the glacial flows in Antarctica. Right? Glacial flows that today are in the order of just over a mile, 1.4, 1.5 miles per year. That's the rate of flow of the glaciers in Antarctica at the moment. These two sets of glaciers are essentially a dam that are preventing that flow from entering the water in Antarctica. Supposing they start to disintegrate, calve, break up, and drop into the sea, the actual impact on sea level rise from the two glaciers it will be minimal. However, at a rate of a mile and a half, and an increasing rate of flow of glaciers in the Antarctic, that will have a significant impact. And it's estimated that that impact could be as much as 2 meters. Recently, we've been doing work in the Arctic region. Why? Why do you say that? Why the Arctic? Well, what happens in the Arctic region, either polar area, obviously affects the rest of the world. And the connection between what's happening in the rest of the world and what's happening today and has been happening in the Arctic over the last 15 or 20 years is very, very tenuous. It's very slim. I mean, we work together with the Arctic Council in some respects, but like the United Nations, the Arctic Council works on the basis of developing normative agendas for member states at national scales. There is virtually no engagement with local authorities that's not self-organized. In May this year, during one of the Arctic events in Anchorage, a group of mayors got together and created the Arctic Mayors Forum and are beginning to build some solidarity across the 8 member states of the Arctic Council with local authorities in all 8 of the countries, which is quite interesting. Their agendas are far, far more different and far, far more pressing than those of the member states at the moment. So it's quite interesting to work with these, not just local government leaders, but also cultural or indigenous leaders in different parts of the Arctic region and hear their views and listen to their aspirations and to their fears about what's going to happen in the future. At the moment, there are 2 counterbalancing events that are taking place in the Arctic. One, of course, is the increasing temperature and consequent loss of the ice pack and loss of permafrost and these types of things, coastal erosion, as I mentioned before, sea level rise, inundations, these sorts of things that are happening. But on the other side, a very, very interesting thing that's happening is that already new economic strategies are being developed predicting ultimately a year-round access to the Northwest Passage, and that will create new economic flows as commercial marine traffic is able to actually transit the Northwest Passage for more than, now it's about a month or 6 weeks every year. Increasingly, and it's expected in the next 15, 20 years that will be that Arctic passage will be open all year round. In which case, we will see the investment in infrastructure required to service that marine traffic in ports around the Arctic. We'll start to see the development of new inland transportation routes to transport goods that are dropped off at different Arctic ports. We'll start to see urbanization processes. In fact, they're already happening. If you go to some of the cities in the far north, you'll see that the urbanization patterns are already starting to happen as the private sector, as the public sector, as individuals start to see economic opportunities happening in small towns and villages, particularly coastal villages and towns throughout the Arctic. And already the anticipation of new settlements that will be built along some of the inland transit corridors that are currently being contemplated. So it has a huge impact. It'll have a huge impact on the economy of the world. It will have a huge impact on the economy of the Arctic region, and it's an area that's really understudied, I would say, and certainly underrepresented by the development community. Okay, so that's a pretty grim picture of everything. I don't want to leave you with a sense of the grimness of all of this stuff. But what do we do next? One of the questions I pose to you is, and I'll pose it also at the close of this, is do we support local authorities, states, even regions in their efforts to protect the towns and cities that are vulnerable to these kinds of effects, particularly those associated with the changing climate and the impacts of sea level rise and these types of things? Is that a good investment? Does it make sense? Or do we do something else? I recently read a paper by this person, Miyuki Hino from Stanford University, called Manage to Retreat. And it seems to me a very dignified way and strategic way to think differently about the future of particularly coastal cities around the world. And Miyuki has created this, I put it up here, I'm sorry, maybe you can't see it too well. It's a bit dense. But it's a very interesting way of looking strategically at the conditions that will facilitate a dignified, managed retreat away from these kinds of threats, versus those situations where, through whatever circumstances, people, decision makers, choose not to act, and what some of the consequences are in the event where they'll be forced to act. So it's an interesting array of strategies for thinking. One where you have mutual agreement, which is where all of the residents of a community or a town or a city agree that ultimately they need to move. And that has a very high likelihood of acting because people, in spite of perhaps some limitations in political frameworks or political regulations, these types of things, are autonomous enough to make the decisions, to make the move on their own. We look at another situation where relocation is for the greater good of the population, but perhaps not with so much mutual agreement or consent, where you have the political will to do something, but you don't necessarily have the population behind you. This is a situation quite often that happens when the decisions to relocate are taken too late, and that there's no choice or limited choice, and so on. You have self-reliance, where people feel that the risk is intolerable, but the potential benefit to them is positive, but it doesn't necessarily have the backing of the political or social or cultural institutions, and therefore is very, very self-oriented. And finally, the one where people just hide, close themselves in, and hope that it all goes away. All right, and all of these manifest in different places I've been for sure, for different circumstances, not only in relation to the threat of sea level rise and climate change, for other reasons as well. You can apply this thinking in terms of any of the dangerous landscape examples I talked about right at the very beginning. Any situation where relocation is inevitable or, let's say, required. So it's an interesting paper, and I urge you to have a look at it if you have a chance. It's the result of a series of 27 case studies that were reviewed of situations in countries where so-called managed retreat was already taking place. Not necessarily from the climate change point of view, but where government and residents had to relocate for one reason or another. And it's a very interesting paper. And it's one that begs the question, about how do we start to change the way that we actually plan, given we know that inevitably these cities will have problems as a result of sea level rise and coastal erosion, the loss of habitat, the loss of environment, the loss of the ecosystems that make cities function. How do we start changing the way planning is done? I use the term predictive planning, and some people might think that, well, that's kind of redundant, isn't it? The truth is it's not. In most city governments around the world, planning horizons are set somewhere between 4 and exceptionally maybe up to 10 years. We're saying that, you remember the 30, 50-year timeline I suggested we take note of earlier? I'm suggesting, and I'm talking with our city partners, to start trying to convince them that realistically you need to have minimally 20, 30, preferably 50-year planning horizons in light of the kinds of threats that are facing some of these cities and the time that it will take to generate the commitments to co-design. This is one of the words we heard yesterday, to bring people together to stand behind the decisions to relocate. It's much more complicated than that, of course, and I don't need to tell you that. But it's actually about managing this relocation process and preserving the rights that people hold and translating those rights to where they will ultimately end up. A very thorny question, but one that inevitably arises in any sort of a land kind of transaction where people are dispossessed and some form of restitution is made somewhere else. Real loss of land, loss of real estate, washed into the sea, submerged. These kinds of losses need to be understood, and we need to find new mechanisms for the acquisition and commissioning of new land. When I talk about commissioning, I'm not just talking about water and sanitation. I'm talking about the translation of rights of use, of occupancy, of development, rights to dispose and hold property. These types of aspects are included in my concept, this concept of commissioning new land. And creating new development corridors. It makes more sense to try to translate the economies of the coast into safer, spatial areas where you're not immediately having to destroy assets that are coastal based. You're rather transitioning those assets into space where ultimately over the long term they'll be safe, they will be resilient, and they'll continue to generate economic benefits for the residents of the cities and the states that they're located in. So 20, 30, 50-year horizon plans. I know it seems ambitious in terms of understanding the political cycles that take place in cities around the world and the imperatives of politics. However, we need to start asking the question, do the imperatives of politics trump the imperative of the loss of the assets and the economies of particularly cities that are exposed in coastal cities around the world? Okay, so all of that background to tell you a little bit about why we developed this urban resilience program. And one of the tools that's used as a part of that program is the city resilience profiling tools. Now, why we do this? Well, yesterday we talked a little bit about the UN. We heard a little bit about the UN. We heard a little bit about Sendai. We heard a little bit about the Paris Agreement. However, they're not the only ones. And by the way, I think the biblical reference is a little bit strong. It's by far not a biblical lesson. What these are global norms. They're not mandatory, they're voluntary. They're not terribly instructive. However, they do give you a framework within which to begin the dialogues where the beginning of a dialogue is difficult. We can always talk about the new urban agenda and the aims and goals of the new urban agenda, which was the last of the intergovernmental agreements that took place between the period of 2015 and 2016. There were 6, actually. The last one was at Habitat 3 in Quito in October 2016, and it benefited from every one of the intergovernmental events that took place prior to that, and incorporated much and many of the norms from starting with the Sendai framework and the SDGs, even taking note of the conclusions at the World Humanitarian Summit that took place also in 2016 in May in Istanbul. The Paris Agreement, the Addis Ababa financing agreement. So all of these things help to benefit and enrich the content of the new urban agenda, and it's one of the more interesting, in my view, collection of relevant normative references that took place in the previous 2 years, and focusing specifically on cities and other human settlements. However, that's a hard conversation to have with a mayor or a planner. What's not a hard conversation to have is one about how do we design more resilient cities? How do we build more resilient cities? That's something that people are interested in having a conversation about. And it's not just because of that, but it's also because of this observation I told you about earlier, about how cities fail and how they succeed. And one of the galvanizing kind of concepts to address failure or success is one that focuses on resilience. You might not agree with this, but as a definition and a starting point for us, it involved a lot of debate. And ultimately, we needed a starting point internally to have a conversation about resilience. And we believe that it's this definition, it suits our purpose, and it suits the purpose of the cities with whom we are working. So it's the measurable capacity of an urban system, any kind of urban system, whether it's a small village in northern Kenya or whether it's Mumbai, any urban system, to be able to absorb and recover quickly or bounce back from the impact of any plausible hazard while maintaining continuity. Now, this sounds like it's a kind of an absolute approach, and in fact, it was deliberately designed that way. Any plausible hazard. Their view was that, well, you can make a climate resilient city if you want, but you make a climate resilient city at the cost of a city that's resilient to the impacts of earthquakes, say, for example, like Istanbul. It's wasted capital, potentially. You create asymmetric investment in cities, and you start to drive development in specific directions that at the cost of other, perhaps more urgent or perhaps more destructive threats and hazards. So it was deliberately set this way, any plausible hazard, and continuity, of course. So it's based on 4 principles. You'll see also that I use this urban system over and over again. I do that for a reason. Hazards, risks, shocks, or stresses, the preservation of life and limitation of injury, enhancing the prosperity of its residents, its physical and built environment, the protection of that, including those that are gained over time through development processes or normal, let's say, urban development processes. And it defines the functions of cities, whether they're economic functions of governance, functions of commerce, functions of culture or social development. These kinds of functions are all the functions that are the reason cities exist. Without the functions of cities, it's not a city, really, is it? Ultimately, the process of building a more resilient city is one that protects the development gains that are acquired over time, and can be a guarantee of sustainability if it's done properly. So the City Resilience Profiling Program generates profiles, which are essentially baselines that measure the weaknesses, the gaps, opportunities, strengths in urban systems. And it does it on 4 primary sets of axes. One that's spatial, and understanding that when we talk about spatial in this term, we're talking about spatial in the entire continuum, from the very smallest plot or parcel of land up through varying scales to urban or to metro or to city scale, but also beyond. And this is a very important element of the analysis of resilience, in that when we talk about interdependencies of urban functions, I don't need to tell you that all cities rely on non-urban space for various different functions that take place within the city. So the spatial axis of this analysis is very important, and it gives us a sliding scale upon which to look at the city system from the very smallest discrete parcel of land, even in the informal organic settlements we heard about yesterday, up through varying scales. The physical or built environment, okay, these are typical, and they happen in any human settlement, whether it's, again, the small village or the megacity, and looking at weaknesses in the built environment. Again, on the functional side of things, where is the policy, where is the regulation, where is the design capacity, where is the economic and commercial continuity within the overall urban system process? And organization. When we talk about organization in this setup, what we're talking about is associations of people. It's not government, nor is it necessarily corporate. The smallest unit of organization is the individual. It's me, it's you. And through different associations of people, we have organization that impact the decisions that are taken in terms of how cities develop, the functions of cities, even to an extent the distribution of the city spatially and its built environment. So it's interesting that we look at organization not necessarily as something formal and rigid, but as associations of human beings that represent the stakeholders that should be, in many cases, and aren't, or are, either influencing or making decisions. And we talk about this in terms of jurisdictional competence is the term that we use, but ultimately what it means is who's making decisions, who's influencing decisions, and who should be making decisions but isn't, or who should be in the room but isn't. Okay, and that's about the stakeholders. This is the approach that's used to, and the manner in which we organize the measurement of many indicators to come up with values to actually measure the resilience of urban systems against whatever hazard profile is plausible for those cities. And it creates a baseline from which we can actually start with as much validated data as possible, influencing what decisions are taken in terms of prioritization of action that's integrated with normal urban planning, urban development, and urban management processes. Now, zooming back out again, when we don't have an opportunity to start a conversation about sustainable development of cities over the long term, one thing we do have is we have access to the commitments of member states. Okay, let's keep it in mind. The UN creates commitments that are made by national governments. The extent to which those decisions are made under the influence of support from local governments is different in different countries. But in general, the negotiation over the finer print, as Jakob was saying yesterday, is done by representatives of national governments, not by local governments. This, however, is an agenda that was written for local governments. And it involves a set of let's say, thematic areas that focus on the creation of enabling policy at national scales to enable local governments to make certain decisions related to their future development. It talks about introducing or upgrading or ensuring that the legal frameworks that enable the cities to function, not necessarily completely autonomously, but certainly that gives them the autonomy to function and control, to a certain extent, their own development processes, enabled by the national urban policies. It focuses on changing the way planning and design is taken place in cities around the world. We need to look at what we have today and what we've created over the last 100 years and try to find ways of changing that positively over the next 100 years. And that involves changing the way we plan and design cities. And what are the drivers of development? It focuses as well on encouraging new ways of generating municipal finance and new urban economies. One of our experiences with the Resilience Program is that the cities that have engaged in the process are leveraging every sort of resilience dividend that they create to generate new investment opportunities in their cities. And this generates new revenues, and it generates different economies and enhances the economies of the cities where we're working. So this resilience idea, this resilience concept actually has a potentially positive financial value in terms of generating new urban economies. And finally, again, with the national policies that enable local implementation of urban development programming. So, as I mentioned at the opening of this slide, the New Urban Agenda is one that benefited from the discussion of member states, the same member states actually, who negotiated the SDGs, who created a new goal and set of targets, like Merhatum under Goal 11, specifically for cities, the Paris Agreement, Sendai, and others that took place in the course of 2015 and 2016. And it creates a very wide kind of policy or international normative agenda that focuses, in this particular case, on urban development over the next 100 years or so, or at least until the next Habitat Conference in 19 years. I spoke a little while ago about rights and the translation of rights in the process of translation or relocation of cities and towns around the world. One of the organizations that I've been working with over the years with UN Habitat, and I will continue to work with in the coming years, is an organization called Displacement Solutions. Its principal is a fellow by the name of Scott Leckie. I don't know if anybody here knows Scott, but he's a very well-known human rights lawyer that spent the last 30 years actually working on preserving the rights to housing, land, property that's either usurped or lost as a result of a range of different kinds of displacement events, whether it's war or whether it's disaster. And he spent the last 7 years working specifically on issues related to climate displacement in countries like Panama with indigenous communities, the Guna community in the Caribbean side of Panama, with the countries of Kiribati and Tuvalu, the Carteret Islands off of Bougainville, Solomons, and on, including, by the way, in Alaska. And one of the outcomes of the work that he's done over the years was the development of this set of principles called the Peninsula Principles, which is a set of guiding principles that help communities who are displaced as a result of climate change to approach their governments and with knowledge about what the responsibilities of those governments are in terms of hearing and addressing the claims that arise as a result of these kinds of displacements. It's an interesting read. There are 19 principles there. They're equally supporting the claim by people who are displaced and governments in terms of articulating their responsibilities under various different treaties and human rights laws. And this particular program I just spoke of, the City Resilience Profiling Program, it's evolved to the point where our conversations now with, not just with city leaders, but also with technical people and other stakeholders in the cities, are grasping this idea of integrating resilience-based analysis and assessment of all development initiatives that take place in an effort to kind of plan out risk and build in resilience, but over the long term, to rather develop a resilient city as opposed to make a resilient city. It's something that happens to be focused on integrating this kind of different thinking in normal urban planning, in normal urban development, and in normal urban management processes, as I mentioned earlier. These are some resources. There are others that are out there. I spoke a little bit with Christian before we started today about the Urban Resilience Institute. It's a network and a platform of universities from different parts of the world who are undertaking applied research into various aspects of delivering a resilience agenda in cities around the world. There are others as well. The Arctic Resilient Cities Network was conceived in Reykjavik in October during the Arctic Circle Assembly, and will be launched during the World Urban Forum in February in Kuala Lumpur. It's an idea about creating partnerships and creating platforms for the exchange of knowledge. And these guys, these Arctic leaders, are interested in having conversations with the leaders in Bangladesh and in Kiribati and in other parts of the world that are facing some of the same challenges they are. So it's a bit about matching aspirations with resources. And those resources include also communities of practice. Michelle is here from the World Bank. That is a part of both the World Bank and the GFDRR are part of the Medellin Collaboration on Urban Resilience. It was launched in Medellin during the World Urban Forum in 2012, and it's a mature network or platform of 10 different international development organizations that are focused specifically on support to local governments around the world in their aspirations to build more resilient cities. And there are others, okay, from the humanitarian side and from the development side, from the academic world, and increasingly from the private sector, who are more and more vested in this process and more interested in supporting it in one way or another. And that concludes my chat for this morning. But before I conclude, I thought, well, you can ask me questions, and anybody's open to ask me whatever questions they like. But I talked about a couple of things in the last few minutes that I think are really important, and they're questions I'd like you to consider as well. The question of fight or flight, what makes more sense, where, when, and how. The question of changing paradigms in terms of planning and urban development. Where do we start? How do we change the momentum or the inertia in urban planning around the world? Understanding some of the things that were raised yesterday and will be raised tomorrow and today in the course of other sessions around transdisciplinarity, around looking at more holistic ways of creating more resilient development pathways for cities. And ultimately, the question of rights, that in the event where flight is inevitable and is the decision that's taken, either by consensus or by necessity, what are we doing about it, and how are we taking care of the rights of people who are being dispossessed through no fault of their own, specifically individual or even corporate, from the property, the housing, the land that they've occupied and in theory at least, have acquired legitimately to another place. How do we do that? Is that a question worth tackling? In my view, it is. But I pose it back to you as well. Okay, that's the end of it.
So we have a few minutes left. We started a little bit late. So maybe we can take some questions. Maybe we collect 2 or 3. So Rajendra, and then Jakob, and then Coco. Oh.
UN system can think about the better life of the urbanization moving fast, but you know, the indigenous people who is living in the valley from the years and years, and now they are facing a real displacement. I can say about the California, the Owens Valley, they have a beautiful river. I walk in 90 days walking water from Mono Lake to High Beach. In 90 days, I seen that whole river they piped and they give the all water to the Los Angeles city. Yes, you can say that this is the better future of the Los Angeles because they receive the more water. But you can think the more than 30,000 Red Indian living on that valley from Mono Lake to Los Angeles. So why not thinking this development? This development is really a disaster, a great disaster. So, and this development start with displacement of the people who is really living there. So why not thinking the UN system about this type of the development?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. This has been an exciting start into the morning. While you were talking, I had thought about 3 fight or flight cases. And one was Bangladesh, which will be overwhelmed by a meter of sea level rise, and where there is an intense discussion about anticipated or planned migration going on. And the country has also some experience. The second case I thought about was Jakarta, which is not only suffering from sea level rise, but also from subsidence, and where people are discussing about the giant seawall. And the third one is the Netherlands, which is so far successfully building its country below the sea level. But it's can hardly be considered to be resilient according to your definition, to be kind of resilience against all plausible hazards. So can you say how you think the new urban agenda is informing these 3 cases, in decision-making on these 3 cases, either by preferring one against the 2 others, or by looking at the kind of these developments as a big lab where you can see what is better and what is maybe turning out less resilient?
We take one more, and then
Okay.
if you can.
Dan, thank you so much. This was really stimulating, and I'm getting into this a lot. You talked about, these weren't the words that you used, but you talked about an inclusive approach. And it gave me the sense that you were trying to describe people living in urban settlements as much as possible having a chance to co-design or define their future. So I'm curious, could you describe the fora or vehicles that this discourse takes place, or how it could take place in human settlements, this kind of co-defining of futures? The challenges seem pretty substantial, but maybe there are also opportunities that have yet to be discovered. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me just sort of try and hit them all in order. This phenomena of the displacement of indigenous cultures around the world. It's not just in the United States, it's in my own country, in Canada, it's in Australia, it's in many other parts of the world. And it represents not insoluble, but in many cases, very difficult to solve situations where nobody is happy. Nobody can be made happy. If you look in Canada, for example, over the last 30 years, you see some of the largest land claim settlements on the planet actually have taken place where ultimately self-governance and self-rule are taking over, or are being granted, let's say, to indigenous cultures, First Nations communities and Inuit communities specifically. Certain things are happening in other parts of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, for example, where in New Zealand it's more of an assimilation process where rights are granted for cultural rights, but not necessarily for land rights. It's certainly not at the same scale as in Canada. The United States has tougher, let's say, regulatory framework in order to find ways of resolving indigenous land rights for North American Indians, both in the continental U.S. but also up in Alaska as well. I mean, one of the communities that we were talking with in Alaska had been attempting to acquire land for relocation since 1994. There is no federal or state legislation that enables the acquisition either through eminent domain expropriation or anything else for this particular purpose. So the legal system in the United States doesn't allow for, let's say, the justified restitution of the loss of rights, both to use, occupancy, and natural resources within First Nations communities, or in the case of the U.S., American Indians. I don't know the answers, I really don't. They're different in different places, but ultimately they require a legal framework of some sort that enables the restitution process to take place, to ensure that either there's compensation or there is some form of restitution to replace this usurpation of rights from others. It happens in many parts of the world, but ultimately it boils down to the ability to apply some form of legal framework. Another good example, just before I close this one out, but another interesting example is to look at the constitutional allocation of rights of use and occupancy for what they call the African community in Colombia. In other words, these were people who had been transported as slaves from Africa to different parts of the world who had escaped, and many, hundreds or thousands actually, migrated for some strange reason to Colombia. And the country in those days actually made a constitutional allocation of rights over a very large area in the southwestern part of the country, specifically for people who had a bona fide right under this kind of an arrangement. Again, it's a constitutional issue, it's a legal issue. Fight or flight, Bangladesh. Well, in Bangladesh, I know that the government is already engaged in the search for suitable, the search and commissioning of land for people who are highly exposed, particularly from Dhaka, but it's not close. The most likely candidates for land are up in the Chittagong area, which has its own problems, historical, that you have something like 6 million people exposed in Dhaka alone, even today, without additional pressures from sea level rise. And so this question of the acquisition, the land is available. It's a much more difficult and complex process to introduce new, let's say, residents, particularly in an area like Chittagong. On the other hand, it's not one of your examples, but the government of Kiribati bought 5,000 hectares of land in Fiji, specifically for the purpose of being prepared for the day when no one would be able to survive any longer in Kiribati itself. So definitely those are two flight kind of scenarios that I think are justified. The process of actually concluding the flight is one, again, that will take time. There's less time in those two countries, Kiribati and Bangladesh, specifically in Dhaka, but than there are in other places. Jakarta, I don't know. How big is this? How big can a seawall be? That's ultimately the question you need to ask, and whether or not how long it's going to be big enough. If you look at what happened in Sendai after the earthquake, they raised the land in many cases and the seawall protection by 8 meters. So they got it wrong the first time, or well, maybe they didn't get it wrong, but certainly they underestimated the potential for these kinds of things, and ultimately are paying the price today for that kind of oversight. Is the same possible in Jakarta? Hard to say. I'm not so sure that the Indonesian government can afford to continue to protect the city from the impact of sea level rise and increasingly huge exposure in Jakarta to meteorological events. Netherlands, the interesting thing about the Netherlands is that, well, I think they gave up. They decided ultimately that we're going to live with the risk that we have and begin to adapt to living with that kind of a risk. And it's a very interesting and quite a unique situation where, okay, ultimately they're going to live with the threat of complete inundation and try to work around that, as opposed to continuing to raise the dikes and build, and protect the land. It's an interesting decision, given it's a pretty wealthy country and it has the resources, it has the capacity. As we all know, the Dutch engineers are working all over the world on these kind of protective sort of structures. But ultimately the decision there has been to hunker down, to use one of the terms that I saw earlier in this article on Managed Retreat, to hunker down and to live with the risk. And that's a decision others will take as well in time. And Coco, on the methodologies for stakeholder engagement and stakeholder fora, I don't think that there's any one set of fora for these to take. They're different in different parts of the world. Here in Germany and in my country, in Canada, and other places around the world, the opportunity to engage in decision-making around development processes there through public hearings and through the regulatory systems of usually local government. I'm not so sure in Germany if you have an opportunity as a German citizen to engage in the national development processes. Probably not, eh? No, I don't think so. You don't in Canada either, but certainly at local scale. These are formal opportunities for individuals, for other associations of people to engage directly on. In the case where local government is weak or the regulatory framework is weak, there are opportunities for generating solidarity amongst citizens that can take messages to government, or take messages to their leaders, can even insist on those messages being translated, whether or not the leaders want to hear them or not. One really interesting structure of governance is in the Philippines, where you have very, very small little bandung leaders that are responsible for maybe 30 or 40 families. And in many cases, there are very good examples of the relationship between the aspirations of the people, their intermediary at the leadership level that goes up to another spatial scale where there are all these leaders meet, which ultimately goes into the municipal or metro scale. So that business of communication is quite finely structured and very interesting. And ultimately the expression of the aspirations of people, or whether it's in a country like Germany, or whether it's in a country like Kenya. Those of you who've been in Kenya recently will have seen the expressions of people as a result of the current political state in that country daily on the streets. Not all of it pleasant, but definitely all of it with a message. And it's a message that the leaders are listening to. So ultimately, you have these options for engaging. These are not the best ones, and certainly not ones I would advocate, but in the absence of any formal process, there are informal processes of engaging communities or putting communities together with other decision makers and having them influence the decisions or even take decisions in the absence of some other decision maker that provide a positive outcome in terms of their own development processes. Sorry, that's not, I know that's a bit kind of not direct, but there are so many permutations in different places, in different contexts, at different times, that I think we need, as development actors, we need to recognize that these various different permutations of engagement of stakeholders are as wide as anything, and we just need to recognize the opportunities when we see them in different parts of the world to perhaps facilitate those kinds of dialogues.
All right.
Yeah?
Thank you very much. It's
No? I think we run out of time, haven't we?
fantastic talk, but we see we could talk the whole morning, right?
Yeah.
But then looks like. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And I've